and colleagues. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. And welcome again. Hopefully, we're closing this month-long plus conference in post-COVID format, filled with solid information, new knowledge, multiple questions, and inspiration. Let me suggest here that what we're about to wrap up is not only a major ideas event, although it surely was that, but perhaps, and even more importantly, it was also a major political event. A political event in a sense that it spelled out loud and clear what commitment to the public interest can deploy. It showed in a time of threats to the financial survival and to freedom of thought and speech in public universities here in Brazil, the power of these institutions to gather and organize information, generate knowledge, expand networks, as well as to craft policies and suggest courses of action for institutional rebuilding. Therefore, I plead, let's leave this conference with a mission to disseminate the simple but powerful idea, and I have a nice quote here from Colin Bradford, the powerful idea that public institutions need to be the vehicles by which leaders take public responsibility for the public interest. Otherwise, markets determine the public interest, which manifestly does not work. It's a very nice quote from Colin Bradford. And by the way, markets dictating the public interest is precisely the kernel of the neoliberal agenda, and we know that it doesn't work. But having said that, let me caution my plea with two caveats. First, markets are not evil, at least most of them. They are extremely useful as vehicles for competition or locus of competition. They invite and reward entrepreneurial skills. They are very efficient for innovation diffusion and even for innovation creation, although innovation creation often happens with a little help of public funds. And the COVID vaccines, I think, illustrate the point. All the major companies got public money to start their R&D on the new vaccines. But markets are primarily concerned with profits, and therefore they cannot dictate what the public interest should be. But second, my second caveat is that public institutions are not panaceas, as we are so deeply aware here in Brazil, as well as in so many other countries. So to work properly, public institutions must be filled with people whose main concern is to protect and advance the public interest. Weberian bureaucrats, if you will, but they must also be supervised by responsible politicians who live for politics instead of living from politics. That's Weber again. So before handing the virtual floor to our outstanding panelists, Kevin Gallagher, André Lara Resende, and Mariana Mazzucato. And Mariana, unfortunately, will be here taped and not live, but all of them are sufficiently well known to dispense introductions. So let me just conclude those opening remarks with the following reflection. The most important lesson that the pandemic taught me so far is that resources and institutions matter, that's for sure, but people make policy. And the meaning of that sentence is that even resource-poor countries and or countries within institutional structures can deliver efficient, very efficient outcomes if they have proper political leadership guiding their operation, and a public interest-oriented political coalition backing it. So people, basically people. And on that, 3 examples come to mind here. Vietnam, Uruguay, and the US under Biden. Well, both Vietnam and Uruguay belong to the first category. They are resource relatively poor countries in terms of resources. And the US belongs to the second. The US has a very thin institutional structure in public healthcare. And if you don't believe that statement, just read Michael Lewis' latest book on the pandemic, and you will start to believe that statement. So both Vietnam and Uruguay delivered very successful responses to COVID, while the US emerged as a disaster case under Trump. So under Trump, it was all chaos. However, the Biden administration produced a spectacular U-turn in the US pandemic management, despite, again, the virtual inexistence of a public health system in the country. So Premonition is Michael Lewis' latest book. It's Premonition, A Pandemic Story. Read that book, please. So the meaning of the Biden administration, in terms of what I'm trying to say, is that with Biden, US got, well, the world in a way, got political leadership in place and a new political coalition backing it. Precisely my points, the points I wanted to illustrate. So to sum up, the bottom line of the reflection is that when thinking about post-pandemic scenarios, we should turn primarily to politics, to the questions of how to shape responsible political leadership and public interest committed political coalitions. And we should then work towards fixing political structures so that they can reward them. So those are some ideas that I think we could certainly discuss better after our panelists deliver their messages. And let me just close by reminding us about the panel rules. Our panelists will each speak for 15 minutes and subsequently react to each other in a 5-minute fire chat. I'll be reacting to Mariana's chat, and then we'll go on. After that, questions from the audience will be taken, and we will close the section with the answers, okay? So, having said that, thank you all for being with us here, and let's get to it. So, Kevin, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with Leonardo and my fellow panelists. This has been such an incredible conference over the past few weeks, and just want to echo what Leonardo said. This should be the beginning of a global conversation, and let's all pat ourselves on the back for a major accomplishment. One of the things that I think is key and that I'll address, make my address focused around, is that the United States and China and the world at large needs to avoid what I call a Kindleberger trap. We're at a crossroads in global economic history right now. We have to choose whether we're going to learn from history or repeat it. The global economic system faces what is called a Kindleberger trap, and that's when one order is run out of steam and a new one isn't quite there to replace it. Our job is to build a new international economic order that's supportive of a green and inclusive transformation of national and global economies, and that recognizes that we live in a multipolar world. The last time we were in such a trap was 1993, after the World Depression, when the United Kingdom tried to convene the world at the London Monetary and Economic Conference. Britain was no longer strong enough to steer world consensus away from a global depression. The United States was not ready or willing to take the helm. The result was the globalization of the Great Depression and World War. We don't want to repeat that history, but we're on the brink as the COVID-19 crisis and the subsequent global economic crisis are analogous to that 1933 moment. Both of these crises and their aftermaths need a new global economic multilateralism as the virus and the financial crisis as the virus and the financial crisis can impact anyone, anywhere, at any time, in any place, as we have seen so acutely. And the response cannot be a series of patchwork national efforts with little to no global cooperation or leadership. Over the past 4 years, up until the Biden shift that Leonardo just talked about, the United States had dismantled or discredited the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the World Health Organization in particular, vetoed efforts at the International Monetary Fund to extend support to the world's poorest countries and to issue new special drawing rights. The one exception was the Federal Reserve, which acted quickly to save the global dollar and advance the economy financial system. But by creating that safety net, it worsened the plight of many of the world's countries, such as Brazil, where there was massive capital flight and depreciation of exchange rates, which has accentuated the ballooning of debt across the world. Asia in general, and China in particular, looks to be where the new source of leadership might arise from. But they are also not ready or not willing to take the helm. We need to build a new multilateralism for the 21st century as we recover from this crisis. And we've learned from history before. After the failure of 1933, a new multilateralism emerged in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at Dumbarton Oaks and San Francisco in the 1940s that created the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the seeds of the trading system, all under a new politics, similar to what Leonardo just spoke of, all under a new politics that emerged after World War II, which in the United States was characterized as the New Deal. That system in the United States that was started in the 1940s, and these institutions have run out of steam, and they face a Kindleberger trap. We need high ambition now to make sure that one crisis doesn't lead to another. We've already seen how the COVID crisis led to financial and economic ruin, and it could easily lead to social crises, as we're starting to see in next door to you in Colombia and in many other places around the world, as grave inequalities have led to dangerous nationalism before COVID and that are laid bare now. And of course, this only accentuates the climate crisis that is among us. Nation states need to put together long-run recovery plans that build resilience, financial stability, equality, and climate justice. In parallel, we need a new international system that supports these efforts without allowing the actions of one country to curtail the dreams of another. So what does this look like? The United States needs to be a major part of this effort, and so does China. We share a world where we're both the two largest countries at this point, and when it comes to the provision of global public goods, the two largest and most systemically connected countries in the world have to work in parallel at minimum and together at optimum. The costs of financial crises, climate change, pandemics, and social unrest outweigh the benefits of decoupling and a Cold War. I won't belittle the fact that the two countries have a growing number of legitimate grievances with each other. But to me, a progressive agenda is to work hard on addressing those grievances on one track and to work just as hard at providing global public goods on another, because we can't afford to do otherwise. To me, there's three pillars of what a United States strategy would look like to do so. First and foremost, that means lead by example. The United States, at this point, cannot just wave its fingers and tell countries to do as they say, not as we do. It's time to start building this new politics that we have in the United States at the national level for domestic and foreign economic policy that delivers growth and opportunity through a just transition to a zero-carbon economy at home and abroad. Number two, the United States needs to work to reform these global economic institutions and align them with these national goals, not just so that the United States can get the right policies in place, so that all nations can. All nations should have a right to a just transition, even China. Third, healthy competition, coordination, and even collaboration with China is necessary and possible, but won't get very far if we don't deliver on the first two pillars. We can't solve climate and social crises on a global scale by pointing our fingers at China. So let me go through those three pillars of what I think a U.S. strategy needs to be in dealing with the United States and China's inherent issues in order to make a stable and more conducive world economy to the transitions that are needed in a post-COVID war. So number one, the number one priority under leading by example is to redirect capital away from unproductive, uninnovative, fossil fuel intensive, and income polarizing activity towards a just transition. Biden's new infrastructure proposal has elements of that, but that's a very short shot in the arm. It's not some of the long-lasting legislation that laid a bedrock and a foundation for 40 years or so that happened under the New Deal. We'll need permanent legislation on the financial sector, analogous to that long-lasting permanence that we had under the Glass-Steagall Act, but this time that sets a playing field for not only a strict classification of what banks can do to make sure that we have stability, we also need to make sure that capital is being directed towards innovative sectors, towards innovation and not corporate buybacks and stock buybacks, towards cleaner technologies, and so forth. We're going to need to reform our development finance institutions. Maybe folks in Brazil aren't aware that one of the things that did happen last year or 2 years ago under the Trump administration is that the United States now has a development bank. It's not as big as the Brazilian National Development Bank, but it's called the DFC, or the Development Finance Corporation. It was proposed under the Obama administration, but sort of laughed at because it wasn't seen as having any kind of political traction. Interestingly, it was revived during the Trump administration and seen as an alternative to the development banks that the Chinese have. And it was one of the only pieces of bipartisan legislation that went through during the Trump administration. Unfortunately, it got off to a really bad start. Those of you in South America may be aware of one of the big loans that the Development Finance Corporation gave right before Trump left office in January. It was a loan to Ecuador, and the Development Finance Corporation gave Ecuador a loan on condition that it would privatize state-owned oil interests to U.S. companies on condition that they blocked access to Chinese technologies. That's exactly not the kind of way that a development bank should be engaging in economic activity. We shouldn't be having yet another round of conditionality and privatization to state-owned assets and to private corporations in the United States. Institutions like that should be out ahead with innovation, industrial policy, and helping countries make these hard transitions so the private sector, like Leonardo said, can follow. It's not inherently evil, but the development finance institutions can help play a key role in having that fundamental buttress. The United States here has a lot to learn from China. The narrative is that China is a bunch of cheaters, but on some level, it's the United States that's been cheated. If you think about it, since 1980, both China and the United States have started to globalize and integrate their economies with world markets. And in so doing, China invested 40% of GDP annually, and an increasing proportion of that into research and development, and including the most mammoth industrial policies in solar and wind and electric battery technology and manufacturing that in effect subsidize global clean technology learning to the point where clean technology is now at price parity with fossil fuels. The West had tried and failed to do that. Without China, we wouldn't have had a chance to meet our climate goals. Well, while China did all this investing, the United States divested and deregulated its economy down to 20% of GDP in terms of gross fixed capital formation or annual investment, and deregulation that has triggered financial instability and inequality. Is it any wonder when one country invests and the other divests that of course, the country that does the divestment is the one that becomes fragile and the one that becomes in pain. We also have to appreciate that China will have a harder time making some of these transitions than we will. They have literally millions of workers and assets in sectors like coal and gas, and they're still a developing country at $10,000 per capita. Okay, lead by example, number one. Number two, reform global economic institutions. Scaled finance conditioned on reform. Greening parts of the world will have negative consequences on some, just like closing coal plants in Pennsylvania or in Harbin will have on workers or communities there. Obviously, Brazil exports a lot of oil to the European Union. If the European Union has a massive carbon tax with a border tax adjustment, that could have a negative shock to Brazil's balance of payments and your core economic activity. When the United States succeeds in getting the United States out of oil, it could have major impacts on Mexico, which sells most of its oil to the United States, and oil for Mexico provides about 35% of the government budget. Progressives desperately need a foreign economic policy that doesn't just make sure that the United States has the policy space for a just and clean transition, but that countries across the world do. In 2018 and 2019, I, with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, led a multi-stakeholder effort to try to put together what we called the Geneva Principles for a Global Green New Deal. These are a set of 5 principles that we think should guide the restructuring of the Bretton Woods institutions. We don't think that these institutions have to go away. We think that was an important New Deal moment, but for the 21st century in the wake of the pandemic, they need to be retooled at a fundamental level. And we think that these 5 guiding principles are what they should be built around. Number one, that global rules should be calibrated towards the overarching goals of social and economic stability, shared prosperity, and environmental sustainability, while protected against capture by the most powerful players. Number two, that states share common but differentiated responsibilities in a multilateral system built to advance global public goods and protect the global commons. Number three, the right of states to policy space to pursue national development strategies should be enshrined in global rules, not prohibited by global rules. Number four, global regulation should be designed to prevent destructive unilateral economic actions that prevent other nations from realizing their common goals. And finally, number five, global public institutions must be accountable to their full membership, open to a diversity of viewpoints, cognizant of new voices, and have balanced dispute resolution systems. When applied to the International Monetary Fund and multilateral development banks, these institutions will need some fundamental rethinking. First and foremost, they'll need new resourcing. What we've learned is that the Federal Reserve only backstopped a very small component of the world economy, only the large companies and countries in and around the dollar system. The IMF went in and helped the poorest countries, but the Brazils, the Colombias, the Nigerias, the Thailands, and so forth have largely been left to their own devices to be able to prevent and mitigate this crisis. These institutions need much more firepower for not only preventing and mitigating crises, but also for financing a just transition. And in addition to new financing, they'll need new ways to organize the balance of decision-making within them. Third thing, and I'll round out here. How am I doing on time, Leonardo?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, yes. The third, if the United States leads by example and plays a role in helping to reform these institutions with room for China in them, then the United States can engage in healthy competition, coordination, and collaboration. In terms of healthy competition, a democratically determined just transition here at home in the United States will be the best way to project U.S. power across the world. If our Development Finance Corporation, our Export-Import Bank, and U.S. companies are offering better quality financing for clean transitions without strings attached with neoliberal policies. It will force it'll force China and other countries to follow. But when Chevron, Vanguard, and BlackRock are the norm, there's no incentive to do better. We can have parallel coordination when the two parties do things in parallel, like we did in parallel for climate change in 2015. China is the largest public financier of overseas coal finance, and the United States is the largest private sector. An example of each country being able to clamp down on those are parallel things that could be done rather than working together if that's going to be difficult. But eventually the countries are going to have to collaborate, especially on global public goods, through reformed international institutions where they might not necessarily have to be head to head, but working within the family of nations might just be the way to do it. There is a new political coalition in the United States, like Leonardo talked about. However, the new political coalition has not made its mind up on China yet. The Democratic Party is very much still very hawkish towards China, but some of the core parts of the new coalition are still in conversation about it. I hope that these three pillars are things that we can have conversations about, not only in the United States about how to think about China, but China and the United States as the two largest economies. Our decisions are global ones, and so we should be having these conversations with people all across the world, like I am with you today in Brazil. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for summing up a very complex set of issues. So we'll take them on after we finish. Andrea, please, the floor is yours. And thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Leonardo and Célia. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel. Let me start by saying that even before COVID, there were very clear signs that Western capitalism was having trouble. The financial crisis of 2008 marked the end of the period called the Great Moderation by economists, where everything seems to be extremely well and markets ruled. But it was already clear, and it became even more clear after the 2008 crisis, that Western capitalism have not given answers to old problems, mainly inequality, both in education, health, and basically quality of life. And new problems appeared, like threats to the environmental, an increasing concentration of wealth at the top 1% of the people, and the hypertrophy of finance. Problems that there were also no answer by the main set of ideas behind this post-Second War capitalism. This crisis led to some political consequences, which I would state first, the distrust, mainly a distrust of the state, of democratic institutions, and of organized politics. And also a loss of common purpose, a retreat to narrower frontiers of identity, to less inclusive and more aggressive attitudes towards the others, those who are not considered us. So the big question today seems to me to be how to reverse this picture towards the desirable tomorrow. And I would stress first and above all else, to get rid of the ideological barriers to this change. And here I use the word ideology, not in the pejorative sense of as biased beliefs, but as a set of plausible beliefs that are used to organize and represent reality. This representation that shapes our world and determines how we produce and how we live. In the 20th century, economics, mainstream economics, became the main pillar of this ideological edifice. In economics aspirations to be like hard sciences, to be superior to other social fields, gave it a kind of an imperialistic proposal in terms of the ideology. Economics was pretended to be not only a description of reality, not simply a mental construction, that a representation to organize the world that has circumstantial validity, but it has the pretension to be the revelation of natural truth, or be scientific like hard science. But being essentially social ideas, political representations, if these ideas are crystallized as natural truth, they become a conservative straitjacket. And the consequence is that is to believe that the world is as it is and it cannot be different. So that's this defense of the status quo became the main consequences of of mainstream economic thinking. This was seen through, first, an apology of free markets, with non-intervention in the markets, and putting restrictions on the state. The reversal of the post-war New Deal, the social democracy, and the suppression of John Maynard Keynes, became the glory of the idea of that the state was a cost to the society, a dead weight, unproductive, and that should be minimized and restricted. Monetary theory was the main instrument for this restriction in the state. It basically, the quantitative theory of money, of which Milton Friedman and the Chicago University School, that were at the center of the counter-revolution to Keynesianism, became mainstream and became dominant. The idea that fiscal deficits are evil, that monetary expansion causes inflation, and that debt to GDP and debt is a burden, public debt is a burden to future generations, became accepted dogmas. The quantitative theory, the idea that printing money necessarily and always provokes inflation, and it's the only cause of inflation, has been proved theoretically, logically wrong. It has been proved empirically false with 2008 and with the experiment of quantitative easing and central bank balance policies. In spite of the 2008 financial crisis being provoked by the excess growth of private credit and a sudden reversal of private credit as it occurs with financial crisis, in spite of that, the conclusion and the policy proposal was for all countries, even developing countries that had nothing to do with the financial crisis, was to austerity. Once again, control the state, and fiscal policy has to be restricted so that confidence goes back and private investment increases. This was called the expansionary austerity, was even peddled by the IMF immediately after the 2008 crisis. Well, now came COVID, a new massive expansionary monetary and fiscal response with more than 10% of GDP in most countries, including in the US, closer to 15%, with 9% of GDP in Brazil, for example, well, helped to reduce the dramatic cost of this of the COVID sudden stop of the economy. There are now the first signs that the critics of this mainstream economics that have always been there, but have been for decades have been ignored, are becoming more influential in the design of public policy. So with COVID, it became clear that there is excess supply of private goods in the world of today, and there is an excess demand, insufficient supply of public goods. That's what we need. We need health, education, public transportation, infrastructure, research and development, and a quick and smooth transition towards a clean energy economy in the world. Well, for the first time with the Biden investment program, we see signs of this policy shift. There are risks to this. Why? First, because there is no clear theoretical framework on which to base this shift in policy. It is not clear what are the limits of public credit, expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. What are the consequences in terms of inflation and balance of payment equilibrium and disequilibrium, especially for countries that don't have a reserve currency. So the big challenge today is first to develop this framework, to understand well, to get rid of old ideas, and old ideas only die when they are replaced by a new set of coherent theoretical representation. But the main challenge today is to rethink the state and its public governance, how to reduce the bureaucratic and self-serving, the patrimonialista in the Brazilian Faro nomenclature, tendencies of the state, how to restore the credibility of politics, organized politics, and representative democracy. This would be the real meaning of fiscal responsibility, not the defense of the old anachronic treasury view of England in the early 20th century. In Brazil, unfortunately, mainstream economists, policymakers, and the media are still in denial, ferociously attached to long proven wrong ideas, zombie ideas, in the happy expression of Paul Krugman. Those zombie dogmas, in my view, are today the main barrier to the return of development and healthy democracy in Brazil and elsewhere. And I conclude here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, André, for a very refreshing perspective that I hope we can discuss more in the following up. So, Robson, can you just put Mariana on tape so that we can listen to her?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, there's many unknowns, but I think the biggest one that we have currently is, do we even have the capacity on the ground to confront the challenges that we have? And, you know, my view is that we don't have that capacity, but how to build it is also unknown because we've forgotten how to build it. We currently have, you know, outsourced the brain of the public sector in many cases to the private sector. The private sector itself has become ultra financialized, in many cases extracting more value out of the system than creating it. So it's not so much about unknowns, it's actually about rethinking from scratch, how do you actually build a dynamic public-private partnership to be able to confront the crises that we are facing, from the climate crisis, the health crisis, the economic crisis, but to do it from first principles instead of just patching up the system. So in the case of the state, there's been too much focus on the role of the public policy as fixing market failures. So you literally are set up to fail because you're always too little too late. You're just bandaging things up. Instead, what we need is a perspective about co-creating and co-shaping our economy to deliver on certain goals, principally inclusive and sustainable growth. But what I've argued in my recent book called Mission Economy is those goals need to be moonshots. They need to be missions that we can actually answer. Did we achieve it or not? And the way to do that is also about looking at within governance of particular institutions in both business and in government, which I think have been misgoverned. So in that sense, I really believe let's start from the outcomes orientation of what we need to deliver and backtrack to make sure we actually have purpose-oriented institutions in both business and government. So the mission economy perspective tries to go beyond this idea of the state is good, is it bad, is it too big, is it too small? It really is about governing the relationships between the state and all sorts of other different actors. And one of the first problems is the state itself, as I've already mentioned, has been framed problematically. It's not even seen as a value creator. It's seen just as a market fixer or an enabler, a de-risker of the value being created in the private sector, which has not actually then allowed it to build the capabilities within public institutions for it to be agile, creative, flexible, and so on. But the other thing is, I mean, the kind of problems we face, they are at all sorts of different levels. Some are at the neighborhood level, some are at the city level, regional, national, international. There's different types of public policies, obviously, that we require to confront those. But I always go back to the idea of outcomes orientation, mission orientation. And for that, it doesn't matter what size of the state we're talking about, we're looking at different tools that are required. You're no longer picking winners, you're picking the willing. You're not there just to hand out money to different types of firms, sectors, or technologies. You're there to help transform those firms, sectors and technologies to move towards the solutions we need. For this, I think for COVID-19, what was so interesting was there was in some countries, conditions attached to the recovery funds that were given to business. Like in France, President Macron said, we're not here just to bail you out, we're here to help transform. And so the recovery fund given to the airlines and given to automobiles was conditional on those sectors committing to reducing their carbon emissions. So that sort of conditionality is about a social compact. When you don't have that, then the role of the state is useless. It just ends up, giving subsidies, guarantees to different actors to stay in place. And I think this focus on transformation and missions as outcomes orientation is equally important for small problems and for big problems. So the point of thinking in a mission-oriented way is not to begin with the idea of how much money do we have, what should we do with it? It's to begin with the question, what do we need to do, and to backtrack and find a way to actually finance it. And by having mission-oriented and outcomes-oriented budgeting, which, by the way, Brazil actually is one of the countries which has been most innovative around, this changes how we think about the debt and the deficit. Many countries have high debt to GDP, not because they are spending too much in the public funds, but they are spending very badly. They are not investing strategically. They don't have innovation systems. They don't have increases in their productivity because the private and the public sector are not doing their job. So really by A, worrying about what the problems are, and B, structuring the institutions on the ground to be as capable as possible, but also the policies to be as strategic and long-term focused as possible, then what you end up seeing is, of course, that GDP, which is the denominator of debt to GDP, should actually grow much more than if you're just worried about your budget constraint and then acting in a very siloed, limited, static way. Again, in many countries which have low deficits, you can still have a high debt to GDP precisely because of the lack of that capability and dynamism on the ground. Having said that, one of the key roles of mission-oriented financing should be to crowd in as many other types of finance as possible. in the business community, but also in other types of organizations. And that crowding in effect, the multiplicative effect, is much higher when you have mission-oriented, strategic, long-run, committed finance from the public sector, as opposed to just handouts, again, to different types of areas based on static notions of what needs financing. For example, a sector-specific approach instead of a problem-specific approach might end up just giving different sectors money, but with no focus on what the transformation is actually required, so it doesn't have that transformative and catalytic effect inside the private sector. We should remember that decades of austerity in so many different countries have really weakened our social fabric. They have made, for example, the COVID-19 crisis much worse than it actually had to be. And austerity, of course, is this aggregate word. It makes people think of just public cuts, to budgets, but actually it falls on very, very concrete structures. In the UK, for example, after the financial crisis, instead of penalizing the private sector and the banking sector, which caused the crisis, we penalized people. So mental health budgets were cut. After school clubs were cut. All sorts of health services were cut in the name of reducing our deficits. And all of this had distributional consequences in terms of who was actually impacted. So it's very dangerous just to use words like austerity without always making it very clear who is being damaged by it, because it's not austerity across the board. We continue to have in so many different countries corporate welfare, which is money given by governments to particular types of corporations. So that's not austerity. The other thing is, a mission-oriented approach, as I've been arguing, really has to have a new social compact at the center. I've talked about conditionalities in order to foster dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic public-private partnerships. And part of those conditions should also be that workers should be invested in as a part of the quid pro quo of different types of businesses getting support through subsidies, guarantees, recovery funds, bailouts, and so forth. And unfortunately, we often don't have that, and we don't even have conditions to make sure that profits are reinvested back into production. In fact, the idea that we have a world without work is completely false. That idea comes from the idea that, robots and AI, artificial intelligence, take over, jobs. But actually, that's always been the case for the last 200 years, that mechanization has been labor displacing. But as long as the profits being earned from mechanization were reinvested back into the economy, and another part, then new jobs, new skills appeared. What you have from the 1980s with the obsession of maximizing shareholder value and share prices through activities like share buybacks and very high dividend payouts and so on, is a lack of reinvestment of profits back into the economy. That hurts workers. That hurts long-run production. That hurts innovation. So we should stop blaming the robots for the lack of jobs and really look inside corporate governance structures and bring this notion of purpose and stakeholder value to the center of corporate governance to make sure that workers are benefiting, but also to the center of public-private relationships through conditionalities that make sure that government funds are not just given out for free, but also as a condition. The condition should be to make sure that we do have more sustainable economies, more inclusive economies, and that workers, for example, when we have a green transition, are being invested in order to transition with the economy instead of outside of the economy. So my desirable tomorrow.
Some problems, no?
Yes. Awesome.
Professor Leonardo, go on, please. Professor Leonardo, please go on.
Wow, the video is not over, right? Have you lost Mariana?
Yes, has two more questions, and it's important. They are really important for the debate. Please.
Can you recover the video, Robinson? Yeah. There is a, I think.
Yes, just a moment, please.
Yeah. Thanks.
Agora você teria que ir até o final, né, para não repetir, por favor. Teria que ir a penúltima.
So now you have to go through straight to the last but one question.
Aqui.
Yeah, okay, okay.
Tá bom.
In this point is okay?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Part of the problem. We need to be listening and be humble. And in our institute, we call it practice-based theorizing, learning from the ground and bringing it back to the theory itself. When you don't have that feedback, you become part of the problem.
Infelizmente vai ter que voltar um pouco, porque a pergunta que ela deixa para os panelistas. I'm sorry, I'm speaking in Portuguese.
We'll have to go back.
He is posing to the panelists is in the last question. So I think we really should go back, please.
That it's just about the lack of ideas, and we need to really treat this as
it's okay for you?
Não, pouco antes, antes.
But because yes, okay, but the question for the panel
here is okay for you?
You could go to the question, the last question, and then we can listen to her answer to the last question, which is about the challenge. If there is any question for the other panelists in terms of what their desirable tomorrows would be. If you can't get that, we can go on. I could go on, no problem. But let's try once more.
Civil servants have had globally, which has made them fear government failure even more than market failure. So my desirable tomorrow is a new education, a new curriculum, a new training, new textbooks for global bureaucrats to be truly more dynamic, more creative, and to see themselves as investors of first resort, not just lenders of last resort, market co-shapers and co-creators, not just market fixers. But that also feeds back to those same civil servants to make sure they deliver on that. So concepts like public value need to be nested within our public organizations to make sure that the public service is structured properly. The question would be, what is the real bottleneck? You know, we all have great ideas. I'm sure everyone on this panel and for the wonderful Desirable Tomorrow conference is saying wonderful things. Where is the real change that's required in order for these great ideas to be implemented? What is the problem? Is it ideology? Is it lack of capacity? Is it, too much bureaucracy? Is it that maybe we don't communicate well enough? What is it? Because we have to stop thinking that it's just about the lack of ideas, and we need to really treat this as a battle. And in any battle, you would make sure that the ground is fertile for the battle to take place. And unfortunately, I think we have focused too much on just talking and not enough on walking, and not enough metrics that are actually signaling whether we ourselves, as people with ideas, need to change. Whether it's how we're communicating, who are we communicating with, or also listening enough. We shouldn't forget that Marx, before he died, he said, "I'm not a Marxist," because he saw how ideological many people were that were calling themselves Marxists, and they were only reading Marx. We need to be reading everyone and making sure that we are modernizing our own ideas, but especially, fighting the fight, which means having the right tools on the ground and not thinking that it's enough to profess. We need to be listening and be humble. And in our institute, we call it practice-based theorizing, learning from the ground and bringing it back to the theory itself. When you don't have that feedback, you become part of the problem.
Okay. Can we get back to the format? Okay. What I'll do now is to start the second round of the panel by reacting to Mariana's talk. It's a pity that she's not here. But anyway, her messages are models of clarity and broad thinking, live or tape. So in that same spirit, I'll pose two broad questions that will be for the panel and for the audience, since she's not here to address them. And if I still have time, I will pose one question for Andre and one for Kevin. But let's go through Mariana first. Well, the first one relates to three terms that did not appear in Mariana's comments. The terms are neoliberalism, East Asia, and China. And that's puzzling to me for three reasons. First, the root cause of virtually all the problems she so eloquently underlines is the neoliberal package, by which I mean, and Andrea touched upon that already, its ideology, its policy package, and its mode of governance, which basically is that markets dictate the public interest. And I already talked about that, mentioned that. Well, this is not, it's not there. She never mentioned that. So this is a little bit part of the answer to her last question to our panel. The second is that East Asia, and especially China, they pose the biggest challenge to the neoliberal package itself, since their state-directed Gershon-Cronian, if you will, development strategies, they contradict every single receipt prescribed by the neoliberal menu. And furthermore, all the policy innovations and institutional restructuring Mariana proposes, they are already in place in most East Asia, and again, especially in China. Let me just touch on that a little bit more. The one place where we can see a fully developed entrepreneurial state operating precisely a mission-oriented economy is China. Public interest as public institutions business, China. The state as the entrepreneur-in-chief, China. Public-private partnerships for growth, technology upgrading, and social inclusion, China. A Weberian bureaucracy, but operating in a Schumpeterian fashion, China. A trial and error policy-making approach, China. The result, the most spectacular case of managed structural transformation with social inclusion in the history of mankind. So those are facts. Those are not conjunctures. So therefore, my question goes, doesn't China and East Asia in general merit special attention when it comes to innovation for the public purpose in a post-pandemic world? That's the first question I pose. The second question I want to pose relates to Mariana's rejection. Basically, she rejects the question of the future with no jobs in her remarks. Or precisely, or to be more precise, her take on the relationship between technological change and employment. So Mariana dismisses the issue as an irrelevant one, since she says this discussion has been happening for the last 2 centuries and the no jobs outcome never materialized. And this is partly right, but the first law of financial markets should apply here, and the law is past performance doesn't warrant future results. So yes, since David Ricardo's 31st chapter on machinery this relationship has been a hot topic in political economy. However, his conclusion in the third edition of the book, precisely 200 years ago, in 1821, was that, and I quote from Ricardo, "The workers might be right in their concerns about the impact of the introduction of machinery on their jobs." So Ricardo did not dismiss the issue. He took it as an important question by admitting that it was impossible to know ex ante the balance between job creation and job destruction due to technological change. But yes, as capitalism evolved, the service sector has been the lifesaver for jobs that were being crushed by creative destruction in agriculture, in mining, and in manufacturing. And this is basically due to the Baumol effect, which means it's very difficult, or used to be very difficult, to raise productivity in most service, in the service sector. But well, then it comes that our contemporary big problem, as far as I see it, which is precisely that the Baumol effect seemed to be on the verge of being eliminated as automation disrupts the service sector itself for the first time. So the jobs lifesaver of the last century is about to go to a very rapid and very disruptive type of change. So automation ravaging the service sector might turn into a completely different scenario from the perspective of technological change versus employment. And again, past performance doesn't warrant future results. So the bottom line here is that we should follow Ricardo and Marx here and not take for granted that enough jobs will always be created as long as, and I quote Mariana, profits from mechanization are reinvested in the economy. I don't think that we can take that for granted. And let's just leave aside questions such as bullshit jobs economy, the question posed by David Graeber, or the rise of the precariat posed by Guy Standing. So summing up, I suggest we ought to address the issue of the future of work and jobs right away and as a political one, with major social disruption in the making. We have so many good books on that. Carl Benedict Freyd, Martin Ford, Martin Susskind, Darrell West, and even Robert Skidelsky. They just wrote very good books on the issue. So summing up, I would label this a pressing public interest policy question and ask if it shouldn't be at the forefront of a post-pandemic agenda that prioritizes innovation for the public purpose. I'll handle to Kevin and to Andrea for their reactions. And if we got time, I would have a question for Andrea and one for Kevin, but let's leave this for later on if we can. So Kevin, the floor is yours for a quick reaction to what we just heard. 5 minutes, please. Thanks.
Yeah, terrific and great presentations by Andrea and Mariana. I think you nailed it. I looked more at the U.S.-China relationship, and one of the things that I said is that the United States has a lot to learn from China, and that we're not willing to do so. So to answer your question and Mariana's at the same time, the key bottleneck for the United States is that we're not reading enough Shakespeare. I think it was in Julius Caesar where he says, "The problem, dear Brutus, is not in the stars; it is in ourselves." And the United States is now pointing a finger at China to say, look, they're blaming China for automation, for inequality, for civil strife, and for a lack of economic fabric in the United States. And rather than blaming China, we should be learning from China. And this gets to your comment that the East Asian miracle in general and China's use of it in particular is a calibration of a public-led innovation. Even though China's has gone into a number of different directions, I think it has the seeds of what the rest of the world needs. And that is an innovation mission-driven task to green the world economy in a way that's socially inclusive and that is calibrated to make sure that one country's benefit doesn't hurt others in doing so. I mentioned in my remarks earlier the massive innovation and industrial policies that China's put together in wind and solar. Without those two, as I said, we'd have no chance to meet our climate change goals. And I think, since you're mentioning so many good books, I think the one that we need a revision of is Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren by John Maynard Keynes. Very important, insightful book of what the world looked like from his vantage point in 1944 to get to some of the issues related to automation and so forth. He thought that so many of our basic needs would be met that we'd spend more time in leisure, more time with each other, more time reading great works, and so forth. We definitely have the technologies to be able to do so, but we haven't organized our economies in that way. And so for those of you who are young scholars, young people, I really encourage you all to read Keynes's Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren and think, what do we want our grandchildren to live in, and how do we get there both in terms of national strategies and a way in a globalized world to coordinate those national strategies to make sure that one country's pursuit of its dreams doesn't infringe on another country's ability to do so. And I think in terms of regulating the financial sector and in terms of innovation and industrialization, East Asia can give us a lot that we can learn from, as long as we're willing to learn and don't blame them on our problems, but realize that these neoliberal policies that originated, many of them in the United States, have been the reason why we haven't been doing so well.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So, Andre, if you could care to comment on what we just heard.
Well, thank you. I'll start by saying, well, when I listen to Mariana Mazzucato, I have really, for me, it's like a breath of fresh air. It's so much. When I was introduced to her book, The Value of Everything, I felt like I was reading what I believed and I wanted to say. And even in her latest book, Mission Economy, comes back exactly to the same point and exactly to the things I believe have to be said and have to be done. So I have a lot of agreement with Mariana, and so let me comment on your questions, Leonardo, about her. First, she doesn't use the word neoliberalism. I don't know why, but I don't use it either. And the reason is that I believe that the word became kind of a label, which kind of a lazy, like all labels, it's kind of a lazy way of saying things implicit that people without reasoning about them. I probably agree that neoliberalism is a good word synthesis for what we're talking. But it's better to explicitly say it than just put everything on neoliberalism and then puts you, look, this is everything I reject, which I don't exactly know exactly what it is. So I try also not to use it. I think it's under this label of neoliberalism, I think there are several nuances of view that have to be understood. They have to be understood and they have to be criticized. Well, with respect to China, not mentioning China, yes, this is something, because I agree with Kevin. I think that economically, China has been doing exactly what Mariana is proposing, what we are doing here. Okay. But I think that the main question with China, and again, Kevin didn't mention that, because the U.S. puts China as an economic challenge to to the dominance and the first place of the American economy. But the big question, the question that we should ask about China, which was not well understood, is China is not democratic. So, and the fact that you have a non-democratic country that is so successful, it's something that's a question that we have to understand. Do you need to give up democracy or representative democracy as we know it to have the kind of economic efficiency in the use of the state that China has or not? I don't believe this is so, but the fact that this is the question that has to be asked. This is the question, if there is something to criticize about China, that it remains a non-democratic and not clearly open political, open, and when I by the word open, I said transparent political system. We don't understand really what's behind the motives of the state and the Chinese government. And this is a question that's still puts some doubts, and I think understandable doubts for those who fear China. Finally, not finally, but answering to Mariana's question, what is to be done? What are the real barriers? I think that I tried to answer that already in my first speech. I said that, well, I think basically it is idea, but it's not lack of ideas, as she said. It is the strength of old ideas. We should never underestimate the strength of old ideas, okay, especially when they are well structured and well organized. And even when they get out of fashion, they are sure to resurface again, coming back on the new moment, and they are never totally dead and overcame. Especially in economics, I've been studying this in the last 1 or 2 years, and basically you see that in monetary theory, these ideas in 18th century, you have already this debate, and the victory of what is today mainstream monetary theory, it wasn't until very recently mainstream monetary theory, it's basically, it was not necessarily an intellectual victory, it was a political victory. By the way, David Ricardo that you mentioned, is one of the exponents of this victory of this view. As Keynes said, the victory of David Ricardo was like the Inquisition; it killed completely the controversy and those who disagreed with him. So it was basically David Ricardo and John Locke, but it's a long tradition. And then it came with Wicksell that was criticizing this, then you have Keynes, and then again Milton Friedman. So there's always, ideas are always there and they come back. Well, and to finalize, with the question of the future of jobs, I'm not sure that the main threat to employment is really technological. We don't know. Okay, it's as you say, yes, for the first time, it is really threatening services, which were exactly the sector that grew into substitute when there is a reduction of an industry, as industry grew when there was reduction of agricultural jobs and employment. But the fact is that I think that technologically, I think other jobs and special person-to-person jobs and services will increase and be more important in the future, that we don't know. But I think that the challenges of artificial intelligence and of technologies, specifically of artificial intelligence, are broader than their effect on employment. They really open serious ethic and moral questions that have to be addressed. And we are not even asking these questions now. And that's it. I finish here my comment.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me just, before passing to our Q&A with the audience, let me throw you, Andre, quickly a question and also one for Kevin, okay, if I may. For Andre, as you explained so clearly, without citing MMT, modern monetary theory, in their approach, which I very much agree with, deficits and debt to GDP ratio, they are not, they lose much of their boogeyman role in derailing a country macro financial order, if you will. However, as you also mentioned, fiscal responsibility is not out, but it still matters. The difference, I think, is that it relates more and much more to the quality of expenditures or the structure of credit policies and fiscal stimulus than with the quantity, with the ratio or the burden of what used to be called the burden of the debt. Well, if that's correct, my question is, shouldn't MMT approach expand its reach by linking public finance with industrial policy? And I ask this because, well, let me elaborate just a bit. Shouldn't central banks and treasuries' actions be linked to some sort of strategic investment targeting expenditures and investment where they would be more effective in granting the materialization of services, inputs, and goods that are needed and would enable sustained and sustainable growth? That's a question that I would like you to comment upon. And just one for Kevin. Kevin, given the escalating technological war that you mentioned, or even Cold War 2.0, that the press is labeling it as we speak, between the US government and China, as well as the sanctions posed by both Trump and Biden to tech firms dealing with China, how should we understand the Wall Street affair with China's financial markets, which it's also getting hotter and hotter? Because we learned that less than a month ago, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, and JP Morgan, they entered in, and my jaw almost dropped, they entered in public-private partnerships with the biggest Chinese public banks, okay? ICBC, China Construction Bank, and China's Merchant Banks. So that deal gave me pause when I read about. And not only because private financial behemoths like the ones that the American ones, they are so difficult to tame, but also because finance itself is becoming more and more a technological-based industry. So in that sense, when we talk or we think about a sort of a Wall Street affair with China, tech is not out, it's very much in. So what's your take on that puzzling bifurcation in US and China policies towards each other? Those two questions for you. Thank you very much. Andrea, you can go.
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Well, let me say, Leonardo, first that exactly as in the case of using neoliberalism, I refrain from using MMT because it is charged with prejudice and preconceptions. And I see that Mariana also does not use MMT, but her reasoning, it's clear that she is familiar and she agrees with MMT. When she says that policies should not be judged on how much they cost, but basically that we should first worry on what to be done and how to do it, and then to finance it. Financing is not the main question in public policy, and by the way, and should not. It's a big mistake. So as I have said several times, basically it are two mistakes with this. The first is to believe that if you secure financing, the problem is solved, which is not true. Okay? And the second is that if you don't have the financing, you cannot do it, which is also not true. It's the contrary. You do it if the right thing. Financing, it's not a problem and it's not a restriction. So financing is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for doing the right things in terms of public policy. Well, but I agree with you that MMT, in a sense, should extend to have more, not an MMT, the new macroeconomic thinking should link industrial policy and have more to say what to be done in terms of fiscal policy. And of course, if this gets to your second question, the coordination of fiscal and monetary policies seems to be imperative. It's a total artificial separation between monetary policy and fiscal policy. When we used to think that money was different from other types of public credit. Money is simply public credit. So there is no difference or no substantial difference, essential difference between money and public debt when financial markets are liquid and developed as they are in the modern world. And money is simply public debt as a perpetuity in terms of public debt that doesn't pay interest. When public debt now has very low interest and could be issued very long or short, it doesn't make any difference. That's another point. The fact is there is no distinction, such a distinction between money and public debt. Central banks do not control the money supply. Central banks control the basic interest rate, and central banks can act through the change in their balance sheet. So clearly, the distinction between monetary and fiscal policy is not that clear. And the point that is this point about this distinction, it's quite clear in Abba Lerner's functional finance, saying that what should be done, and which took Keynes' ideas to another step forward. I think that this is the base where we should start to rebuild this macroeconomic framework. And I finish here.
Thank you. Kevin, did you care to comment?
Yeah, great remarks there. I couldn't agree with those more. And I know you asked the one about China, which I'll answer. But China's also somewhat answered your question to Andres in terms of the use of the central bank. The way that China set up its financial system is that it has a set of core banks that are backed by the central bank, and they have annual priorities of the kinds of things that should be financed, which sectors can and which sectors can't, which is important. And the European Union, its central banks are starting to think about that through its taxonomy discussions it's having around green central banking. There's now a discussion not only on incorporating climate risk into central bank decisions, but also to have green quantitative easing that they're saying. Quantitative easing, sort of supporting the balance sheets of certain kinds of technologies versus others. That isn't one kind of industrial policy. Obviously, the kinds of industrial policy that countries in the South are going to need are different than those in the North. But Leonardo, you hit on an incredible sort of puzzle that throughout the past 40 years, the United States-China relationship has been controversial, but one of the most steadfast supporters of a strong relationship between the two has been the private sector in the United States. I'd say the large corporations, especially the manufacturing sector, and the financial sector. Those two, that's starting to change a little bit. The real sector, or the manufacturers and so forth, from say 1999 until 3 or 4 years ago, they really had strong ties with China. They were willing to go through all the rules that China has on its end. But now, through its targeted industrial policy, China did what a good policy would want for an outcome, which is learn technological innovation, learn different kinds of technological capabilities, and make them indigenous to your own makeup. And now China has its own firms that compete with many of those U.S. firms that are there. And now those firms are a little less supportive, and they're actually part of the new politics in the United States, where you have footloose multinationals more apt to support industrial policy in the United States, because they saw that without that help, that they were losing ground in the Chinese economy. The financial sector is different. The financial sector has been a steadfast supporter of China relations. Goldman Sachs, that you mentioned, Leonardo, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, Goldman worked with China to create the Shanghai Free Trade Zone and to help many of its state-owned banks and state-owned companies go public in New York and do their different IPOs. And these latest set of investments and engagement, like you said, are just the newest manifestation of that. To be honest, on one level, we have to think creatively about how on one level there's a bit of a hypocrisy. So why will the United States financial sector, the most powerful financial sector in the world, be okay with capital controls, be okay with regulating finance for innovation and industrialization in China? But whenever there's a conversation about stiff regulation or steering finance in particular directions here in the United States, that same sector is the first sector to be against it. It's something that needs some thinking. I haven't quite sorted it out yet, but it's interesting that the sector is fine with being part of one system in China, but would never, whenever any of those kinds of conversations come about regulating the own sector in the United States, they're completely against it. Like you said, also, the financial sector is completely engaged with technology. Much of China is a place where a lot of the financial sector and Wall Street experiments with blockchain technologies, crypto, and so forth, things that are slower on the take here in the United States. China's become the place to experiment and innovate on that. And so investing in China is important for future innovations of Wall Street. Perhaps to end on a positive note, if Wall Street lets itself be regulated in China, again, the United States needs to learn from China and figure out ways to regulate Wall Street here at home and direct a financial system towards one that's productive, innovative, and green, rather than one that is unhinged from the real economy. The financial sector in the United States has grown by a factor of 300. Global assets now are somewhere around $300 trillion in the world economy since 1980. There's a 300% increase. But investment, gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP, has actually gone down, right? That is the fundamental bottleneck to get to what Mariana asked us to deal with, that I see with the financial system, especially in the United States. We've created an incredible financial system that feeds on itself rather than feeding our dreams for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Before just passing to, we don't have lots of questions from the audience, but let me touch on two issues. That one that you just mentioned, that about Wall Street and China. What puzzled me, I will repeat, is that this is happening in the middle of an escalating confrontation between the two governments. And even though Wall Street and the Chinese banks, they managed to increase their partnership, and you have Ray Dalio and you have the hedge fund managers, all of them saying, let's go to China, we have to be more invested in China, etc., etc. So this is just like, I don't have a clear answer to how can we frame this up, but it certainly is something to be studied. And another thing that I that I want to frame here, which one that André touched upon, which obviously I agree with, it's that the China question, and of course the session, the panel itself revolves so much about China and Asia, that I think this is already a lesson in terms of how do we think about the post-pandemic world. Well, we're not going to be mimicking China or East Asia, but it's certain that we can learn something from them. And there, I think that it's useful to flag two things. The first one is that when we say that China is not a democratic system, obviously it isn't. But if we add another question, which is okay, or another reflection, which is okay, they don't have political rights, but they have been getting more and more economic and social rights. China left 800 million plus out of the line of poverty, and they are expanding their educational system and their safety net, etc., very fast. So in other countries, you have, they vote, we vote, political rights are there. What about economic and social rights? This, I think, is another very pressing question for today. And when we add East Asia to the picture, meaning when we add Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, let's remember that their model was what? They began with very authoritarian political systems, and then they gradually democratized. They first took care of economic and social rights, educational reform, land reforms, and others. And finally, they got to reform their own political systems. So this is something that I think we should at least pay attention to in terms of, okay, again, let's not just mimic them, but let's try to understand their dynamic, because clearly it's the most dynamic region of the world right now as we speak. And I have a question here, which I think it's more for Andrea, but it's not related directly to your talk. I think it relates to from Priscila Machado, which is about artificial intelligence. I think you mentioned, well, the most important questions are the questions that arise from artificial intelligence, the challenges it poses. I think she's interested in maybe knowing a little bit more of, okay, what are the most pressing challenges that are coming from artificial intelligence right now? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, let me try to be very, very short on that. I think yes, the questions are they go from the implication for what is called autonomous weapons, which can be, and you can just have various weapons that are not even controlled remotely by people, that can kill and destroy, and how much this removes responsibility, which is one question. These weapons are already in place, and they exist already, and they are already being used. This is one of the questions, ethical questions that we have. A second one, and it goes to the ideas that, well, algorithms has been shown that are less biased than human for judgments. This is one of the questions. These are the questions that are discussed, for example, in the new book by Daniel Kahneman on that, and say, well, what do you do? Are we willing to rely on algorithms instead of human judgment? This is a major question and that have implication. And then we can go even to further in the way of discussing what are the implications of a non-biological intelligence that we know is going to be immensely more powerful than our intelligence. Will this intelligence be able to have a will on themselves? Is this intelligence capable of at the end controlling and making human subservient to this kind of intelligence? This seems to be far-fetched, but it's a question that at least we have to ask and to think more deeply. So there's a range of ethical and moral questions that are extremely important related to artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is developing, as we know, all technological innovations exponentially. So they've been developing slowly, but now they're going up extremely fast. So it will happen very fast in the next years. So we have to think and to have answers and to have public policies about these questions, these challenges related to artificial intelligence.
So, thank you. Couldn't agree more. So, you care to comment on this, Kevin?
Let me say something about the economic and social rights of the democracy, which I didn't note before. And on the Wall Street story, this is definitely something that needs to be studied. There's got to be a political economy story here. Biden has already restricted many kinds of investment that the Americans can no longer invest in China just in the past couple of weeks. But there's still these surges. So is there some, investors make bets, and they're betting that they're going to be able to hold on to these assets. And so what's going on there is something to be understood. But one of the big reasons why the United States and the Democratic Party in particular has gotten so much more tense with China is that they felt like their strategy of what they called constructive engagement failed. The idea was the politics in the United States of those sectors that wanted to engage with China over the past 40 years had the following narrative: that if China joined the liberal economic order, the IMF, the trading system, etc., if we brought them into the community of nations, that they would eventually make that transformation that you talked about, Leonardo. But the observers in the United States, and this was epitomized in a October 2019 speech by Mike Pence, the former vice president under Trump. Of course, he's a Republican, but you hear many Democrats say the same thing, is that instead of China becoming more open politically over time as the country has become more well off and all these social and economic rights have become more universal, it's actually backpedaled in terms of openness on other political rights. Obviously, at the very top, Xi Jinping has consolidated his power. The long-standing meritocracy, where there'd be replacements, seems to be gone, with Xi Jinping likely going to go into more and more terms of office, and other rights. Obviously, situation in Hong Kong and situations with the Uyghurs can be pointed towards a retraction. So I'm not going to make my takes on those particular things, but that's what I think folks around the world need to understand, that the United States in general, right, both parties have thought that strategy of constructive engagement, bringing China into the system to share the economic pie with them, to help them gain economic and social rights, would lead to political openness. They feel like that failed, if that was ever a genuine thought in the beginning, and so now they're abandoning it. Right? They're abandoning that strategy. There's two pieces of legislation running around Congress right now. One of them by Menendez and the other one by Schumer. Right? These are Democrats, but they're both seen as the Cold War legislation. And they have all sorts of things that the United States would do on a regular basis to decouple from the Chinese economy and potentially kick them out of international institutions. One of them being the Inter-American Development Bank that we share with you folks in Brazil. So that's the change in thinking by the mainstream elite in the United States, is that path is not going to happen, and therefore that's part of the rationale for this new antagonism against China. I think a bigger part of it, though, is the fact that we have been hurt so much from a divestment and deregulation strategy, while China has done so well with an investment in steered regulation that has expanded those economic and social rights. Politicians and elites have convinced the American public that the reasons why we are suffering from inequality, bad infrastructure, poor technology, and innovation are because of China, not because of the fact that we're divesting and deregulating. We need to face that in order to be able to deal with China and to be able to get back on our feet. Biden's making real good steps in the right direction, but the politics of China still needs to square with that agenda.
Yes, thank you very much. And one thing that I just a very quick comment on what you just said. To me, a serious mistake that almost all U.S. presidents, it's not a divide in between Democrats and Republicans, but it's the attitude of the, let's call it the U.S. establishment, political establishment as a whole, is to expose to try to always begin with the following proposition, not only to China, but especially to China. Look, you have to become more like us. And this is a terrible mistake. Imagine if China is more or less saying no, explicitly, no, we don't. No, we don't like a lot of what we see. So don't tell us what we should be doing, because, as you mentioned, a lot of things we got right. So we're not in the mood anymore of being taught in terms of, look, this is where you should be going. And if you don't, we're going to be your enemies. This is a very big mistake. And that mistake is being committed mostly by the United States. China is not saying to the United States, look, you should become more like us. They're not doing this. So this, I think, is a very big problem ahead. This is a very big problem for a post-pandemic world as well. So I will just stop here and say that perhaps the two lessons that came out from this session here is, the first one is, well, we should be paying much more attention and trying to learn something from East Asia and China, even if we don't want to mimic them or if we don't accept everything they do. There is a region that we have to be learning from. And the second one is in response to Mariana's last question for the panel, which is, well, where's the bottleneck? Where's the bottleneck? Is it in ideology? Is it in bureaucracy? We will say yes. In part, it is in ideology, yes, in the power of old ideas, as Andrea stressed so well, but also it's not only the power of old ideas, it's the power of old ideas and who they serve. So it's old ideas coupled with the sort of political coalitions and the in place. So this is really a very powerful way of understanding why things don't happen, and they haven't been happening in so many places. So where's the bottleneck? The bottleneck is in the lack of political leadership, the wrong, let's call it wrong, political coalitions in place, and yes, the power of old ideas, and I repeat myself, and who they serve. There's where's the bottleneck, I think. And I don't know right now, I'm not getting questions from the audience. So should we sort of wrap up here and give the rector of Federal University sort of the space to close the event, or is there any pressing questions or comments from the audience?
Leonardo, I would like to invite our rector, Professor Denise, to speak here.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, we can wrap up.
I'm so glad that she's here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so the floor is yours, Rector.
Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Ana Célia.
Obrigada, Leonardo e Ana Célia. É uma grande alegria para mim estar aqui hoje. Infelizmente, não pude estar aqui durante toda a manhã, pensando sobre o nosso futuro desejável, nossas amanhãs desejáveis, mas na semana passada eu tive a oportunidade de ver um encontro onde ouvi o Prêmio Nobel falar sobre mudanças climáticas e o desenvolvimento sustentável. E ela foi realmente muito sábia e falou sobre algo que a gente tem que realmente pensar. Ela estava simplesmente pensando sobre o papel da tecnologia e o papel do comportamento, o comportamento das pessoas. E ela
for the future that people change their behavior. If we do not change our behavior, it's not technology that will bring us a better tomorrow. I would like to talk a little bit about this, and surely it was a really very interesting conference, and she brought some important differences in the future, like the importance of double-blind placebo studies, not only in the health area, but also in economic area and the sustainable development area. This is a change of mind, a complete change of mind. I am just thinking about this, since I'm from the health area of knowledge, and I'm habituated to double-blind placebo studies, but I can imagine double-blind placebo studies in climate change and sustainable development and economics area. We have to change our minds to have a better future, I'm sure. And we have to be aware that humanity, solidarity, and the environment, these 3 points are crucial, not only for present life, but mainly when we think about emerging and re-emerging disease and climate change. All these are linked, they are all together linked, and our research universities are central institutions in these important issues. We have to discuss more and more and be aware of the role of these important institutions that are research universities. So let's discuss more in the near future about mental health, sustainable economy, if it does exist, renewable energy sources, because these topics will surely lead to a better world for future generations. I would like to thank you again for your presence here today, and all the other panelists that talked during this important event for our university. I thank Ana Célia Castro for organizing these seminaries, these webinars, and it's a great pleasure for us to have you here. And we have now all these materials so that we can learn more and more, discuss about these important issues for the future of humanity. Thank you very much.
Okay. So at this point, I think we need to wrap up, right? So I really want to thank everyone and our panelists and the audience. And let's leave this month-long conference with the idea that this was a major ideas event, but also a major political event, because it showed the power of public institutions in terms of gathering information, generating new knowledge, suggesting policies and suggesting courses of action for institutional restructuring. So this is something that only public interest committed institutions can do. I'm not saying that the public universities are the only ones in the game, but they are certainly one of the most important players in that game. And I think that from that perspective, the conference really achieved its major goal. So I'm happy with the results we have, and I'm looking forward to continue the conversation with all of you. And thank you very much, and I'll see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Robson, maybe we can
The
stop.
recording has stopped.
Excellent. So I invite you to open your videos, please, if you want, just to... Hi, Lavínia, Raffaele, Juno, Marta, Armando Orique, Estela, Guilherme Ari. Thank you. Paula Nazaré. Thank you. Priscila.